Welcome to Insights, where we have conversations about different topics in today's culture and society. Insights is part of Faith Online, which exists to help you discover and deepen your faith through our online space. We hope that you have a wonderful and fruitful time with us today. Let's get right in.
Today is Insights 5, and the title is Earth Matters, the Christian Faith and the Future of the Planet with Pastor Tim Healy. And of course, I'm flashing this up on screen right now, and if you're reading it, Pastor Tim Healy comes with a lot of experience and a lot of deep study and understanding into Christian environmental ethics. That's where his research focus was on. And before he went into theological education, he pastored two churches, and one of which is in Perth, Western Australia. And he's also a passionate wildlife photographer for those people who are interested in that, with a deep interest in how Christian faith shapes the future of the planet. So without further ado, please welcome Pastor Tim. Pastor Tim, over to you.
Thank you so much, Keith, and good evening to everybody. Thank you so much for the kind introduction and the warm welcome, and really grateful for the opportunity to spend this time with you tonight talking about this really important subject of Christians and the future of the planet. So I'm going to take a moment to share my screen because I have some slides that I want to work through with you, and we'll dive in. Now, I've been speaking about the subject of Christians and the environment for almost 2 decades now. And I've come to realize that when the subject of Christians and the environment comes up in conversation, particularly in the context of local church life, it's often met with varying response. And so some people are quite enthusiastic about the idea of Christians participating in responding to environmental affairs. Some are somewhat indifferent and perhaps a little disinterested. Others are mildly concerned. And then, of course, there are some who are outright antagonistic toward the idea. And I've come to realize that the objections that people raise to the idea of Christians being at the forefront of responding to the environmental challenges of the 21st century usually fall into one of 4 categories. And they'll say, first and foremost, that it's depressing. Let's be honest, talking about climate change and global warming and food shortage and water scarcity is also doom and gloom. And we're a community of faith, hope, and love. So why would we bother talking about all these things? And of course, when you consider the overwhelming nature of the environmental challenge facing the world today, it's very easy to feel like your contribution is not making a difference. You can kind of feel a little like you're throwing spitballs at a hurricane. So why bother? So some say it's depressing. Others say, well, if not depressing, then it's certainly demeaning. And by that, they usually mean that there's a concern that if we start giving rights and resources to non-human life forms, even if those life forms are sentient, like the animals with which we share the planet, that we are somehow taking away from humanity's unique place and purpose in the divine scheme of things. So if we give $10 million to saving habitat in Borneo to preserve habitat for orangutans, well, that's $10 million that's not going to starving children in Africa. So it becomes an ethical dilemma. And so the concern there is that if we start allocating rights and resources to non-human life forms, that we may inadvertently reduce humanity's value or diminish humanity's value in the scheme of things. Still others say, well, if not depressing and not demeaning, then it's certainly dangerous. And by this, they mean that they are concerned that if we get involved in the environmental issues of our day, that we might potentially open ourselves up to some kind of ungodly or unholy influence. That's because many people associate environmentalism with things that they perceive to be a threat to the faith. So we associate it with things like pagan spirituality or New Age philosophy or radical kind of extreme left-wing ideology. And so if you say the words environmentalism or environmentalist or talk about green issues, and people kind of conjure up images in their minds of hippies kind of dancing semi-naked in the forest around a fire, drinking mineral water and eating tree bark or something, right? There's an association, the connotation that's attached to environmentalism that's not always necessarily true and accurate, but many people perceive those things to be a threat to the faith. And so there's a concern. If we as Christians start getting involved in environmental matters, we could potentially open ourselves up to some kind of ungodly, unholy, or unrighteous influence. And of course, the worst case scenario is that we all end up worshiping the earth, Mother Goddess Gaia, or something like that. So there's a concern there. Still others say, if not depressing, demeaning, or dangerous, then it's certainly distracting. And by this, they usually mean that if we give time and energy and resource to getting involved in environmental affairs, then we are taking time, energy, and resource away from the main game. And for most people, they would consider that main game to be preaching the gospel and saving souls for eternity. And of course, that particular perspective assumes a very narrow definition of the gospel and a very narrow understanding of what the mission of God is in the world, but nevertheless, that is the argument. So all of that to say, simply, if you are joining us tonight and you have felt any one of those concerns or thought any one of those thoughts, I want you just to relax and take a deep breath, because you're in good company. You're not the only one who has those concerns. There are many others who do as well. And I hope that by the end of this conversation, you will at least be open to the idea that Christians getting involved in environmental issues is certainly not cause for concern. There is no need for fear or alarm. It certainly isn't depressing, demeaning, dangerous, or distracting. In fact, I think that Christians have a very important role to play and a very important perspective to offer. And hopefully by the end of tonight, you will be at least open to that idea, if not fully persuaded. Now, of course, any conversation about Christians and the environment has to begin with Scripture. We have to shape our perspectives on our involvement in environmental matters around good theology and sound doctrine. And so when we turn our attention to the Bible and we consider what the Bible has to say about our relationship to the earth, we find that there are four big key theological ideas that sit at the very foundation of how we as followers of Jesus should view the earth and therefore relate to the earth. Now, we don't have the time to deep dive into all of them. I'm just going to simply highlight them and say a little bit about each. But the first big kind of foundational biblical perspective concerning our relationship to the earth is this idea of earth as creation. And by that, I simply mean that earth is God's deliberate and intentional design and construct. Earth is not an accident. It's not a coincidence. Earth is not the product of randomness. Earth is the product of God's intentional creative activity. And as such, it serves a very important purpose in the divine scheme of things. And so God as creator stands over and above his creation. He is not embedded in it or expressed through it in the sense that you might find in, say, an Eastern worldview. In many Eastern worldviews and philosophies, nature is seen as simply an extension of God or an expression of God. And that's why it's possible in certain Eastern philosophies to worship stones and cows and trees and planets, because all of those things are considered to be simple expressions of the divine. Not so in the Christian worldview. In a Christian worldview, we see God as independent of his creation, over and above his creation. And so we worship the creator. We don't worship the creation. And of course, that idea is attested to throughout Scripture, but it's found quite literally in the opening line, Genesis 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So earth is God's creation, and it is good, and it is sacred, not divine, because it is not the essence of God, but it is sacred in the sense that it is set apart for divine purpose. It's there to serve God's divine economy, and it plays a very important role. The second big theological idea that we find in Scripture that should shape our perception of the earth and our relationship with it is this idea of creation as revelation. And by this, we simply mean that God has revealed something of himself in a general sense through the things he has made. David, the psalmist, in Psalm 19, celebrates the universality of that revelation when he says, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the earth shows forth his handiwork. He says, day to day utters speech, and night to night reveals knowledge, and there's nowhere in the earth where they are not heard. In other words, David is saying there is something about the cosmos that is shouting the presence and the glory of God. And of course, Paul picks up on this idea in Romans chapter 1, verse 20. And he says that God has revealed himself through the things he has made. In fact, not only has God revealed his presence and his existence, but Paul goes so far as to say that God has revealed his divine attributes, his essential nature, his character, which is a profound statement because Paul is saying that it is possible not only to know that God exists, but to know something of the character and nature of God by studying the created order, by literally taking the time to stop and smell the roses and get your feet in the sand and get your skin in the ocean and, lie on your back in the field at night and look up at the stars and ask yourself the question, what is all of this telling us about God? Because all of it reveals something of the nature and the character of God. And if you consider for a moment, the infinite creativity that is revealed in the fact that, there are no two fingerprints that are identical, no two eye patterns or voice patterns that are the same. The fact that God every single day gives expression to his creativity in sunsets and sunrises. If you consider the macrocosm and the microcosm, the balance and the fine-tuning in the universe, if you consider all these aspects of the created order, all of them tell us something about God. The fact that he is an artist and he is an engineer and he is a designer, you can tell something quite profound about God by just simply studying the created order. And so C.S. Lewis had a wonderful way of illustrating this. He said, imagine for a moment you were walking down a beach early in the morning, and as you crossed the sand, you noticed ahead of you a large, rather ornate and elaborate sandcastle. And if you walked up to that sandcastle and said to yourself, well, look what the wind and waves brought in overnight, or look what the tide washed up, you would be considered crazy. If you saw a sandcastle like that, you would look at the design, you would look at the size, you would look at the intentionality behind it, the design, and you would conclude there was a mind behind the activity. Somebody built that. Somebody thought it up and brought it into existence. And C.S. Lewis kind of argued it's exactly the same with creation. You cannot help but look at creation and conclude the only logical conclusion, and that is that there's a mind behind the design. This is intentional. And so earth is part of creation, is part of God's revelation. And every time we lose a part of the earth, or every time something that constitutes God's creation disappears, we lose something of his revelation. All right, the third big kind of theological idea that sits at the foundation of our perception of the earth and our relationship with it is this idea of earth as God's possession. And in Psalm 24, verse 1, it says, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. That's bad news for some of the large corporations who might lay claim to ownership of the earth. Truth of the matter is the earth does not belong to any corporation or to any national government or to any state government or to any charity or to any ethnic group. The earth is the Lord's. It is his possession and everything in it. He lays ownership claim to the earth, and he has given us stewardship responsibility. And the difference is simply that owners have rights and stewards have obligations, responsibilities. And so as possessor of the earth, God loves it and God sustains it and God upholds it and God interacts with it precisely because he lays claim to it. And the reason God can lay claim to the earth and claim his ownership rights is firstly because he created it, secondly because he sustains it and upholds it, and thirdly because he ultimately will one day redeem it. So the earth is the Lord's. It belongs to him. And then fourthly and finally, the last big theological idea underpinning our perception of the earth and our relationship with it is this idea that earth is our habitation, or earth is our home. As human beings, this is the only home we have, and it's the only home we will have. Earth has always been an important part of God's intention for the human race. And as such, human beings, being the only creatures made in the image of God, have a very special role to play in the earth, a unique purpose. And that is clearly articulated in what we call the cultural mandate in both Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2, where God said to Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it and oversee it, manage it, steward it. Yes, be productive with it, be creative with it, but do so in a wise and loving and responsible and sustainable way. And so as human beings who have this unique nature and this unique role and purpose in the earth, we have a very special part to play in the economy of God. Now, of course, it does beg the question, given humanity's unique place and position in the divine scheme of things, and given our unique role and responsibility, does God care only about the people, or does he also care about the planet? Now, I've often heard people say, Tim, you know what? I care about what God cares about. And God cares about people, so I care about people. God doesn't care about birds and bees and flowers and trees. God cares about people. And so I care about people. And the problem that I have with that way of thinking is, firstly, I think it's fundamentally flawed, in the sense that I think it's erroneous to say that God only cares about people. I think if we're going to be faithful to the biblical witness in both Old and New Testament, we have to acknowledge that God's passion is over all he has made, as the psalmist said, that he is loving towards all the work of his hands. In fact, Jesus himself said, you know, if a single sparrow that is not worth more than 2 copper coins, in other words, something that is of not great economic value to God, if a sparrow falls to the ground, he said, your heavenly Father is aware of it. That is how intimate God's knowledge is of his creation. Paul, for example, in Colossians chapter 1, tells us that it is through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus that God intends to reconcile all things to himself. All things. Not all people, but all things. In other words, there's a cosmological dimension to the redemptive mission of God in the world. And of course, we as human beings, being part of that creation, get to participate in that redemption. We get caught up in it, but it's not exclusively about us. God intends to reconcile all creation and restore and heal all creation. So I think it's fundamentally flawed to say that God only cares about people. I think we can clearly substantiate from both Old and New Testament that God does care about all creation. But the second reason why I think that thinking is flawed, this idea that God only cares about people and not the planet, is because it fails to recognize an almost blindingly obvious truth. And that truth is simply the fact that human beings do not exist in a vacuum. Human beings live on planet Earth. This is our home, right? And all known life in the universe exists within this tiny sliver of habitable space that we call the biosphere. Now, relatively speaking, it's incredibly thin. It's about as thick as a layer of varnish on a cricket ball. That's how thin it is. And the biosphere is made up of a thin band of the Earth's near-surface crust and a thin band of the Earth's atmosphere just above the surface of the Earth. And all known life in the universe exists within the biosphere and depends on the biosphere not only for quality of life, but for life itself. So you cannot say that you care about people but that you don't care about the environment on which people depend, not only for their quality of life, but for their very existence. You cannot say that you care about people, but then not care about the quality of water that people need to drink in order to survive. You can't say that you care about people, but then that you don't care about the quality of air that people need to breathe in order to survive. You can't say I care about people, but then not care about the quality of soil that people need to till in order to sustain their subsistence living. If you genuinely love people, then you are going to care about the environment on which people depend, both for quality of life and for their very existence. So if we are going to be truly representative of God's love and compassion and care and concern for humanity, then our concern has to extend to the environment in which people live and on which people depend for their very existence. Of course, because of this, we can quite feasibly trace our care and concern for people and for their context all the way back to what we call the Great Commandment, Jesus' summation of the law and the prophets. And you would know this well when Jesus was confronted by the Jewish religious leaders of his day and asked, what is the greatest commandment of all? He said, well, I'll sum it up to you. It's love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And at the end of the day, caring for the environment and stewarding creation in a wise, loving, faithful, kind of responsible and sustainable way is nothing less than love for God and love for others. It is first and foremost love for God in the sense that it is obedience to the cultural mandate given to us in chapters 1 and 2. If caring for creation is a human vocation, which it is, it automatically becomes a Christian vocation, because not every human is a Christian, but every Christian is a human. If God mandated humanity in the very beginning to be wise, faithful, responsible custodians of the earth and its resource, then that responsibility falls to every single Christian by virtue of the fact that they are human. And to be obedient to that mandate is nothing less than an expression of love. Jesus said, if you love me, you will obey me. In other words, God interprets our obedience as love. The best way we can express our love to God is through our obedience, not necessarily through our passion. I'm all for passion, and I'm all for emotion, and I'm all for expression in worship and in other ways. But the best way we can show our love for God is through our obedience. And so obedience to the cultural mandate, not just as Christians, but as humans, is an expression of that love for God. And then it is also at the same time an expression of love for neighbor. Only caring for creation requires us to extend our definition of neighbor and calls upon us to recognize that our neighbors include those who live downstream, downhill, downwind, and downtime. Your neighbor is not only the person who lives down the street from you, but the person who lives downstream, downriver, downhill, downwind, and downtime. And when we care for the environment and steward it faithfully and wisely, we are loving our neighbors well. So that is, in short, a very quick overview, if you like, of some of the biblical and theological underpinnings of a creation care mandate and a rationale for stewardship of the earth. Now, of course, we could say so much more about that, but for the sake of time, I want to change gears, and I want to spend a little bit of time just asking and answering this question, because this is really where a lot of the concern lies. And the question is the planet facing an environmental crisis? Every single day, you and I are bombarded with all sorts of messages from the media concerning some kind of impending environmental crisis. And the information can be quite overwhelming. It's hard to know who to trust, what is true, and who to believe. And so it's important for us as Christians to have some sense of what the scope and scale of the environmental challenge is facing the world today. Now, I know many people connect the idea of the environmental crisis to the human population. I think it was Philip in his intro alluded to the fact that somebody had once said, Paul Ehrlich, I think it was, that the Earth's population can only support, or the Earth's resource can only support a population of 2 billion people. So it does beg the question, is the population too large? We're sitting at 7.9 billion people now. Are there too many people? And you might be surprised to find out that the answer is actually no, right? The problem is not the size of the Earth's population. In fact, if you took all 7.9 billion people and you put them shoulder to shoulder and back to back, you could fit all 7.9 billion people into an area roughly the size of metropolitan Los Angeles. The point being, we do not take up that much space. Now, of course, you're going to need more than 1 square meter in which to live. So if we expand that out and give everyone, 20 square meters, the entire Earth's population would fit into an area roughly the size of Texas, with a bit of spillover into the surrounding states. The point simply being, Earth is actually a very big place. And as human beings, we don't take up that much room. However, that said, there are some very significant issues that are tied to population dynamics that are of concern for the environment. So what are they? Well, the first is what we call demographic momentum. And demographic momentum just simply refers to the age structure of nations and how that age structure changes over time. So, for example, if you have a look at this graph here, you will notice that the blue shaded area represents the growth of the Earth's population, which is currently standing at 7.9 billion people and is expected to plateau somewhere around 10 billion people over the course of the next 50 to 100 years. At the same time, you'll notice that the red graph represents the growth rate or the birth rate of the human population, which has been rapidly declining since the 1960s. So the birth rate peaked at about 2.1% in the 1960s and began to fall dramatically as a result of socioeconomic factors like the introduction of birth control and people wanting to downsize and spend less money on their kids and more on themselves. And it's been in free fall ever since. It's currently sitting at about 1.2%, and it's estimated that it'll drop all the way down to less than 1% in the not too distant future. Now, you may look at that graph and wonder to yourself, how is it possible that the birth rate is declining so rapidly, but the Earth's population continues to expand? Well, the answer is demographic momentum. Because in many parts of the world, particularly the developing world, although there are women having fewer babies, there are more women having babies. More women are entering the reproductive years of their lives. And even though they're having fewer babies, more of them are getting pregnant and giving birth. So back in the 1960s, the average number of children per woman was around 6. It's currently 3. But there are more women in the world today having those 3 babies. And that is why the Earth's population continues to expand, even though the birth rate has been falling rapidly for the last 60, 70 years. That is demographic momentum. And demographic momentum is putting pressure on the environment. Of course, in addition to demographic momentum, we also have the issue of concentration. So the fact that human beings have been moving for the last several decades en masse into cities. In fact, in 2011, for the first time, there were more human beings living in cities than living in rural areas. And by 2050, it's estimated that 70% of the world's population will be living in cities. Back in 1974, when I was born, there were only 2 megacities. A megacity is a city with a population of more than 10 million people. Well, today there's in the order of 32 or 33 megacities. So there's been a mass migration of people into high-density living areas, And that concentration of people puts pressure on the carrying capacity of the area in which they find themselves. And of course, that strains the resources and makes it really hard to sustain that population. Thirdly, we also have the issue of technology. So technology, of course, is both a blessing and a curse, particularly when it comes to the environment. And technology has, of course, enabled us as human beings to make ever greater impacts on the environment. So if you, for example, think about a lumberjack who perhaps would, cut down trees 150 years ago. If a lumberjack wanted to cut down trees, he would get up in the morning, sharpen his axe, head out into the forest, and maybe cut down 1 or 2 trees a day. However, today you can jump into an automatic tree feller and drive out into the forest and cut down 100 trees before lunch. Right? Technology has enhanced our capacity to destroy the environment. And so technology is a factor. Fourthly, of course, we have the issue of consumption as well. The fact that today, as human beings, we consume more than we have ever consumed before. And so much of that consumption falls into the category of luxury, not necessity. We consume enormous amounts of non-essential goods and services, and that consumption puts an enormous amount of pressure on the environment. A number of years ago, I was doing some research on consumption levels in the world and came across some interesting statistics. These probably need to be updated because they're probably a little out of date now, but you might find this surprising. When it comes to what the world consumes in any given day, on average, around 2.25 billion cups of coffee. Right, most of those are consumed at FCC. 135 million chickens every single day. 1.7 billion servings of Coke, 89 million barrels of oil or fuel, 600 million disposable nappies. That's a lot of consumption, right? And probably a lot more now. So consumption is a major issue. And so the question then becomes, so what impact is all of this having on the environment? All that concentration, all that consumption, the demographic momentum, and the impact of technology, what is this doing to the environment? And of course, the impacts are multiple. Now, of course, front and center is the issue of global warming. And global warming is an interesting kind of consequence because on one level, global warming is a natural phenomenon. All right. Global warming is the term that we use to refer to the dynamic that makes Earth habitable and livable. So as you know, the sun, its radiation penetrates the Earth's atmosphere. Some of it is absorbed by the Earth, which warms the surface of the Earth, and some of the radiation is released back into the atmosphere. And it's this dynamic that makes Earth habitable and sustainable. Now, of course, what's been happening over the course of the last 180 to 200 years is that through our increases in industrialization, we've been pumping more and more what we call greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Gases like carbon dioxide and methane. And this has resulted in a thickening of the Earth's atmosphere. And so some of the radiation that has been absorbed by the Earth and reflected back into the atmosphere is simply bouncing off this thickened greenhouse gas layer and is retained within the Earth's atmosphere, which has resulted in a slight warming of close on 1.5 degrees Celsius over around the last 150 years, which doesn't sound like a lot. But if that increase continues, it only takes 2 or 3 degrees Celsius increase, and the weather patterns on Earth can substantially change. Now, of course, if you're kind of sharp and alert and you're thinking carefully here, you might say to yourself, well, hold on a second. If the Earth's greenhouse layer is thickening, then surely that would prevent some of the sun's radiation kind of getting in the first place. If that thickening of the greenhouse gas layer is trapping radiation, would it not also prevent radiation from coming in the first place? And you'd be absolutely right. And in fact, the phenomenon is referred to as global dimming. And global dimming, to some degree, offsets global warming. So the fact that our increase in temperature at the Earth's near surface has been limited is partly due to the fact that there is less radiation coming in the first place, right? So global warming is, on one level, a natural phenomenon, but at the same time, there's been an increase in that warming rate, and it is currently being argued that that is due to the increase in greenhouse gases as a result of our industrialization. Of course, the consequence of global warming is believed to be climate change. You can see from this particular chart that there is undeniably a correlation between the amount of greenhouse gas particles in the atmosphere and the average temperature at the Earth's near surface. Now, of course, any good scientist will tell you correlation is not causation, but you cannot ignore the correlation. You have to at least consider the possibility that it is the one causing the other. And many believe that the consequence of this is going to be climate change. Now, unfortunately, climate change is also one of those misunderstood phenomena, in the sense that climate change has actually been happening for as long as the Earth has been in existence. And there are all sorts of reasons for climate change, everything from tectonic plate movements to the orbital patterns of the sun and the Earth, to volcanism, solar flares. There are a number of causes of climate change. And so climate change itself is not in question. It's easy to substantiate that climate change has been part of the Earth's history for as long as the Earth has been in existence. What is currently being debated is anthropogenic climate change. And the question being asked is it possible for 7.9 billion highly industrialized, highly consumptive, technologically advanced human beings, is it possible for them to impact the Earth's environment enough to cause climate change? And of course, there are some within the scientific community who would say not only is it possible, but it is inevitable, and that there is sufficient evidence to argue that that is the case. So currently, as far as the debate's concerned, without doubt, global warming and climate change are the most debatable aspects of the environmental crisis, and therefore the most debated, but they are not the only issues. And this is probably the one point that I want to underscore more than any when it comes to this issue of the impact on the environment. If we take global warming and climate change off the table, so let's just hypothetically say, for the sake of this conversation, that global warming and climate change are non-issues. There are nevertheless still several very significant issues, ecological issues, that are clearly anthropogenic in their nature. In other words, they are directly related to human activity and human behavior. And they are things like critical ecological imbalance, pollution and waste, so water pollution, air pollution, light pollution, noise pollution, resource depletion, so the rapid removal of non-renewable resources, habitat destruction, deforestation and desertification, removing the Earth's green lungs to make way for agriculture and development, both industrial and residential. Of course, species loss. We know that species are becoming extinct at a rate roughly 100 times the natural rate of attrition at the moment. So species do go extinct naturally. In fact, there isn't a single species living on the Earth right now that has been on the Earth for its entire duration. So all species go extinct eventually, and they go extinct at a natural rate. But currently, we are losing species at a rate of 100 times the natural attrition rate. This picture is a picture of the last surviving northern white rhino. It's a male white rhino, and you can see it has 24 hours security with it. Now, unfortunately, this photo was taken about 3 years ago, and since it was taken, this northern white rhino has died, meaning that the northern white rhino species has been removed and eradicated, which is a tragedy in itself. Over the course of the last 60 years, That's less than one human lifetime. We've seen all the big cat populations decline by over 90%. I don't know about you, but I find it hard to conceive of an Africa without lions. And yet it's quite feasible that in our lifetime, the lion population of Africa will go extinct. That's a staggering thought. 96% reduction in the wild populations of the big cats in Africa and Asia. Tragedy indeed. So I'll conclude with this quote from Russell Butkus, who said, when viewed through the lens of Scripture, the environmental crisis is best understood as creation in crisis, which elevates the significance of our situation to the very heart of God. I think that's a wonderful way to see it and to understand it. There is no doubt whatsoever that our Earth is facing a significant series of environmental crises, and it's not hard at all to substantiate that these are anthropogenic in nature. And even if you are, for whatever reason, a climate skeptic, you would nevertheless have to acknowledge that there are at least a dozen, if not more, significant environmental challenges facing our world today that are tied to human activity and human behavior. And I believe that as followers of Jesus, we should be at the forefront of responding to these challenges with wisdom, with conviction, with passion, and with hope, so that our world can be better for all. And hopefully all of us will be able to contribute in a meaningful way to that. So I'm going to stop sharing right now and hand back to the team, and we're going to get ready to field some questions and some discussion. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Pastor Tim. Philip's back. Philip, would you like to?
Thanks, Pastor Tim. Hey, everyone. I'm calling from Singapore because, my best friend just passed away, and we were together with him. I was together with him since, first grade, primary one. And I just come in and help to attend his funeral. But, I was just thinking, as someone who is in my 50s, to be honest, what happens to the environment, I probably will not be here to see its full effects. So whatever that we can do and contribute is actually for the future generations. In your opinion, Pastor Tim, if I can ask you a question, what do you think we should do? I mean, are these efforts of recycling, consuming less, and all that kind of thing essential? I mean, as you have mentioned, you can fit everybody on Earth back to back in the Bay Area, right? So, but it seems that it is the luxury, the high impact things that are causing it. So, practically, in terms of practical steps, what would you think that we should be doing?
Yeah, there's no doubt that the scale and scope of the challenge that we're facing is going to require structural change and policy change and large-scale macro change. There's no doubt about it. So we're not going to turn the tide by just simply, changing our light bulbs to LEDs and all recycling. Now, that said, those things are valuable and they need to be done. And if every single individual takes responsibility for what they can do, then eventually we will turn the tide. So at a personal level, being diligent about managing your water use, reducing your consumption of electricity by switching your light bulbs to LED, putting renewable sources into play in your residence if you can, going solar. All of those types of personal lifestyle changes, reduce, reuse, recycle, those are important. They are part of the solution, but they are not the entirety of the solution. So we are going to require infrastructure change if we're going to move away from non-renewables to renewables. Right now, our infrastructure just simply could not handle a wholesale shift. We're going to have to move gradually over time, but we do need to move. And so I think what each individual has to ask themselves is, firstly, what can I do? What can I do as a person? What can we do as a household? And then beyond that, you've got to think about where you might potentially feel moved, motivated, and inspired to have an impact. So you can't do everything. and you're not going to be able to address every issue. But you need to find out what resonates with you, what moves you, what makes you kind of motivated and inspired to get up and do something. So for me, I mean, you mentioned the African wildlife photography earlier. I have a deep passion for African wildlife and wildlife preservation and conservation. So I put a lot of my time and energy and resource into that particular aspect of environmental concern. But for someone else, it might be the issue of water scarcity, or the issue of pollution, or the issue of deforestation that resonates with you. And so you need to find out what it is you're passionate about addressing. And there are lots of things that you can do, whether that's raising awareness around the issue, say through social media campaigns, having people around to your house and talking about the issue, sharing resources and sharing information about what people, that type of activity, that type of initiative. There are so many things that you can do at a personal level. But I think the key is first find out what it is you are passionate about, what moves you, what motivates you, what kind of fuels your righteous anger and your holy discontent, and do what you can for that particular issue, recognizing that you just simply won't be able to do something about everything.
Oh, fantastic. That basically answers Jonathan's questions. Two questions. One's from Jackson Chiang. Thanks, Jackson, for your question. He asks, what are your thoughts on this statement? This planet is made for us. We must care for it by not trashing it unnecessarily. But the Bible also tells us to steward it well. So we also have been told to enjoy it, and that means if for the furthering of human flourishing, this planet takes some knocks, I'm okay with that because God said so. What are your thoughts on that statement?
Yeah, great question. And I wholeheartedly agree in the sense that God did intend the earth to be a resource that sustains our existence. But the key word there is sustain. So if that resource is going to sustain us and those who come after us, that resource has to be managed in a wise, loving, responsible, and sustainable way. But God does expect us to be creative and productive. That is part of the cultural mandate. So God does want human beings to flourish, and he does want us to build and to create and to establish culture and enterprise. Now, all of those things are fundamental to what it means to be human. So yes, Earth is our home, and it's supposed to be the place in which we live, move, and have our being. And we're supposed to thoroughly enjoy it. And it's true that we cannot eliminate our impact entirely. You can't. Daniel Goleman, the guy who wrote Emotional Intelligence and became famous for that particular book, he wrote another book called Ecological Intelligence. And in it, he talks about what he calls the green myth. And he says that at the end of the day, it's impossible to entirely eliminate your impact on the environment. You can only minimize it and you can redirect it, but you cannot remove it altogether. So we are going to impact the environment, no doubt about it, but we have to do our very best to make sure that whatever that impact is, that it's minimal, and that in whatever way we engage the resources that are available to us in the world, that we do so in a way that is sustainable. So yes, human flourishing, by all means enjoy the earth, but do it wisely and lovingly and sustainably.
Which is leading us to the next question. I think particularly this point about wisely and lovingly. Do you think that climate change is a serious crisis as elaborate climate activists and global institutions such as WWF and USA? I mean, for myself, I find myself flipping between 2 points of view, Pastor Tim. Right? On one hand, okay, let's say renewables. Okay, the very fact that we are all trying to go renewable, wind energy, etc., is basically bringing focus and attention away from fossil fuels, which essentially come up with this current crazy situation where, the Europe is buying most of its gas from Russia, and this enriches Russia, which is allowing this entire Ukraine crisis to carry on, which leads to even more pollution of the environment. And America, which is actually energy independent during Trump's time, is now no longer energy independent, but instead going to Syria, going to Iran, going to Saudi Arabia to ask for oil. So the unintended consequences of, being very pro-environment seems to be very impactful as well. Because like you say, wind energy, and I've got a friend who is in charge of all the Siemens wind energy farms and all that. It's practically very difficult because it's not consistent. So to shift away to go to electric cars still need to be charged, right? In the end, it's still coal-fired plants that feeds it. So I think all these attempts to solve the environment problems seems to be creating more and more problems, as what this gentleman or lady is saying. Climate change, serious crisis as a left-wing climate activist and global institutions such as WEF, are all these good intentions leading to, more craziness in our world?
Yeah, look. There's a lot there. Let me come back to the first question regarding climate change, and is it a serious concern, or is it some kind of radical, kind of left-wing ideological ploy to control the economic agenda of the world? There's no doubt about it. We can't get away from this, that the issue of climate change is being politicized. Now, that in itself is not surprising because every single social issue we face gets politicized. So I have no doubt whatsoever that all parties on the political spectrum are going to want to lay hold of this social issue and leverage it to their political advantage. So those on the left are going to do it a certain way, and those on the right are going to do it another way. But everyone is going to politicize the issue, and they're going to try and leverage it to their political advantage. So let's not be surprised when an issue like this gets politicized. I know that of all the environmental issues we've spoken about, climate change and its partner global warming are without doubt the most controversial. Right, that's where the controversy lies. That's where the debate lies, and with good reason. So there are people within the scientific community and outside the scientific community who would say that at the very least, climate change is possible. Like, it's possible logically, it's possible scientifically, it's possible theoretically. Yes, it's possible. Anthropogenic climate change is possible. It's possible that 7.9 billion highly industrialized, highly consumptive, technologically advanced human beings can impact the environment in such a way that it shifts the climate patterns of the world. Others say not only is it possible, but it's probable, like as in it's likely to happen. And then still others say it's inevitable, that there's evidence that it's already happening. But there's no doubt about it that the jury's out on this, right? And part of the challenge with climate change is that we can model, we can forecast, we can predict, we can project as best as we possibly can based on the science. But this is unprecedented. Like, we have never had a situation like this before. The Earth has never had a population of 7.9 billion highly industrialized human beings. So we just don't know. We just don't know if it's going to be as bad as our projections suggest it is. And only time will tell. The difficulty is we can't afford to risk the worst case scenario. We can't afford to not do anything. We have to almost assume the worst possible outcome, and we need to respond. So my personal conviction is, look, and I'm not a climate scientist, so I'm not pretending to be. I am a theologian, and my primary concern is about helping Christians understand where this sits theologically and biblically. But I've read extensively about it, and I am convinced that there is a genuine concern here around climate. I do believe that it's likely that we as human beings, because of our consumption, concentration, and activity, are affecting the climate. Now, to what extent and what the ultimate consequence will be, nobody knows for sure. But the potential consequences are so far-reaching that we cannot afford to do nothing. Do I think that it's a radical left-wing cultural Marxist conspiracy to take over the world? No, I don't. I'm sorry, I don't buy that. Like I've heard the concerns about the IPCC and its relationship to the UN and all the power brokers who control those particular institutions, but I'm convinced that the issue is bigger than them. And I think there's enough support in the scientific community to substantiate that. So, I hope that clarifies that. And yeah, you're right. As far as the move from fossil fuels to renewables is concerned, there's no doubt it's going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight. And moving to renewables is a better solution, but it's not a perfect solution. So electric cars are better than diesel and petrol powered cars, right? But it's not a perfect solution. And so we have to, in a sense, accept that there isn't going to be a magic wand or a silver bullet or an easy path towards a better world. It's going to take time and it's going to take transition. And these solutions are not necessarily perfect. They're just better.
Yeah. So
my point is that it's actually making things worse.
Well, I don't know that it is. I don't know that it is making it worse. I think in some ways you could possibly argue in certain parts of the world it might be, in certain locales it might be worse, but overall I think it's better.
Yeah.
Leslie, would you like to unmute to make a comment on this?
Who?
Leslie.
Leslie, yeah. Leslie from Rock of Ages.
Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good.
Okay, good. Now, I'm asking a question because we are coming in from the Christian angle. And I'm looking at a couple of things happening. In fact, many things happening around the world right now. So we take the latest crisis that is emerging in Holland, the Netherlands, and in Canada, and in certain part of the US, even the federal rules coming out in the US. Now, we first of all, we move from the concern for carbon dioxide, methane, and right now, coming from the UNWEF, they are talking about the concern for nitrogen being released into the air. And because of all this concern, what is happening is that they are proposing policies that are being taken very seriously, integrated into the European Union commissions. And these have become, in a sense, rules and laws being implemented. And we're seeing this thing happening in Netherlands. So it's like, you look at what's happening right now. Within a month, all right, within a month, they are trying to force the farmers a lot of farmers out of business, okay, in order to keep to the policies. So now I totally agree with you on the concern for our creation and the fact that this is God's creation. We have to take good care of it and so on. But I am looking at a situation right now happening in Europe. Okay, Sri Lanka, we know what happened to Sri Lanka. 2019. In 2019, they buy into to this whole idea about using organic fertilizer because of nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and so on. Right now, we are moving towards, a cow burp, a cow fart, and cow manure. That is causing climate change.
Leslie, can we keep our point shorter, please?
Yeah, so my point is that you're looking at this whole thing, laws, policies, and all that are being implemented on a very wide scale basis, affecting especially the Western Hemisphere. And to me, it seems to be quite clear that there is an agenda, a global agenda behind to control nations, and of course, from controlling nations to controlling population. Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree, but I would say that that's true of that's true of every issue and of every political process. So there may be political entities that are seeking to push through certain laws and regulations and changes based on their political preferences, and they'll leverage issues like the environment and others to do that. But then at the same time, there will be counter policies and counter laws that would be advocated by people on the other side of the political divide for the same purpose. And this is, I guess, part of the benefit of living in a democracy, is that you have the push and the pull between these various political representations, and we as the people kind of get to decide who is in power and then who gets to exercise those laws. So ideally, what I guess Western democracy hopes to achieve is that through that push and that pull, by not having any one political party in power for too long, by not allowing dictatorships, we allow something of a moderation to happen, right? So you might have several laws and policies that get pushed through during one political administration's tenure, but then those get moderated, or they get overturned, or they get rebalanced by future generations of political leadership from the other side of the spectrum. So I guess what I'm saying is that dynamic is unavoidable. Like, that is part of what living in a Western democracy is. And so yes, there's no doubt about it that there are political agendas, like on both the left and the right side of the political spectrum, and they're unashamed about it. Like, so, but that doesn't mean that climate change is not an issue. It just means that all sides of the political spectrum are going to try and leverage the issue to their advantage. And if that means overemphasizing it and creating fear and panic around it, then they'll do that. If it means diminishing it and trying to dismiss it as a hoax, then they'll do that. It all depends on what their political advantage is. So we just need to be aware of that and not blind to it, and conscious of those political kind of aspirations behind it. But certainly the fact that there are political agendas doesn't take away from the fact that there is an issue. There's a very real issue.
So the facts are there, but we need to be careful who is pushing what agenda.
And I would just say this is why I do believe it's important for Christians to be active in the public sphere and in the political space. You as a contributing member of a Western democracy, you have a voice and you have a vote, and you should use it. Not just as a Christian, but as a citizen. It's just about being a good citizen. Yeah.
Sorry, can I just share the Lynette's question first, because it just fit in so well with what Pastor Tim just shared. Because Lynette was asking that this is a convincing argument from the lens of biblical worldview, but how would you convince non-Christ followers that we need to protect the environment? Lynette, I always thought that it was Christians who were a little bit more reserved, and that generally the general public is very interested in environmental issues already. Would you give us a bit more context to the question, Lynette?
Well, yes and no. I think it is, if you look from the commercial perspective, a lot of companies, they are thinking about the depletion of profitability once they are involved in all these climatic issues, environmental issues. You have to spend a lot of money to solve the problem. And at the same time, they also need to demonstrate profitability for the business, especially for public companies, where you need to demonstrate increase in your profitability. So I wouldn't say that in general it is true that non-Christ followers are buying this issue, this matter. So my question is really, how can we convince them, short of saying that this God's is a cultural mandate? Yeah. So how can we better have this narrative?
It's a great question. And I think for particularly the business world, it has to make business sense. And I think you can make a strong argument for the business sense behind responsible stewardship. I mean, the whole concept of the triple bottom line is supposed to highlight that. The fact that for businesses to really function and thrive in our 21st century world, they've got to be cognizant of not only the economic bottom line, as in are we making profit, but they've got to think about the impact on the community and the impact on the environment. And businesses that get that are going to succeed. And I think there are some good examples here in Australia. I don't know if you can remember a number of years ago, Coles had an ad campaign with the big red hand. Remember the prices are down, the prices are down, that annoying little jingle. And for them, their whole marketing campaign was around this idea of we offer low cost, right? We offer low cost. The prices are down. But something shifted recently, and you would have noticed this, because their advertising campaign has moved away from cost and price and saving. And they've focused now on the issue of the environment and the community. And so they'll say things like good things are happening at Coles. They emphasize local industry and supporting local farmers. They're realizing that if they don't shift their messaging, it's going to impact the bottom line. If they don't communicate to their consumers, to their customers, that they are genuinely concerned about the community and about the environment, then ultimately that's going to affect their bottom line. Because consumers don't just care about the price; they care about the cost, and the cost is not always reflected in the price. Okay, the cost is borne by the planet and by the communities that provide the goods and services that the retailers distribute. And conscious consumers care about that cost. So you're not going to convince them by just telling them they're getting lower prices. They want to know, what are you doing about the cost to the planet and the cost to those who produce the goods and services. So we have this tidal wave, I think, of what I would call conscious capitalism or conscious consumption. People are becoming far more astute and far more aware as consumers, and businesses need to recognize that. So I think it makes good business sense to shift towards sustainability and renewables. And I think if you're going to have that conversation in the business world, that's where I'd be starting.
Which brings us nicely to something that Pastor Benny just mentioned in the chat. Greta Thunberg, our girl who is an extreme environmentalist, right? Yeah. What do you think of her posture? Should we all become like her? Is to be a extreme environmentalist, or how do we do it right in the eyes of God?
Yeah, look, I mean, for us as followers of Jesus, right, we're a community of faith, hope, and love. Okay, so I think part of the value that we can add to this current conversation is that we're not afraid. We're optimistic. We're hopeful. We have a God who has intention for us and for our world, and that intention is good. And we don't have to be angry to be effective. In fact, somebody once said, "You're never persuasive when you are abrasive," and I think there's truth in that. And so I think we can raise our voice and we can lend our voice, but I think we can do so in a way that is hopeful, that's optimistic, that's loving, that's gracious, that's firm, that's clear, but that isn't angry, antagonistic, or abrasive. And I think if we do, I think we'll be a lot more effective.
Which comes to the last question, right?
Yeah, so Andre Chan has said that should the church lead society in sustainable efforts across business, government, and personal lives? It is part of a loving God and our neighbor and the church that has many leaders in its midst. So why has the church ceded leadership on this front to other groups on this important spiritual and ethical issue?
I would say the church should lead, absolutely. And I think we should collaborate, and we should be willing to partner with any organizations or businesses, be they faith-based or not, that are making advances on this front. In fact, one of the most powerful things that we saw happen when in the context of Riverview Church, we began this conversation and we launched our green teams, which were just essentially volunteers who went out into the community and began to do meaningful work in the community on this front, is we sent those teams out to work with organizations in Perth that were already making progress and were already doing good work, non-Christian organizations that were helping to address the environmental challenges in our city. And the fascinating thing that happened was that, for the first time, you had these people of faith kind of going shoulder to shoulder with people who had no faith, people who ordinarily would not set foot inside a church. And all of a sudden, they were having conversations about life and God and faith and the motivation for why we were there and what we were doing. And I thought that was wonderful, because I think what it does is it highlights the missional aspect of this. There's a missional aspect to the church's presence and involvement in environmental issues in our world, whether that's at a political level, a business level, or at a personal and individual level. When we venture into this conversation and into this space and we start contributing meaningfully to it, I'm telling you, the world will sit up and will listen. And what we noticed was that paradigms and perceptions about Christians were challenged and changed. And I think if we're willing to communicate to the world that we care about what they care about, we are concerned about what they're concerned about, and we're willing to serve those cares and concerns lovingly, kind of without agenda, I think they might rethink their perceptions of the church and of Christian faith. And we certainly found that to be true. Some really wonderful conversations and some great relationships were formed between Christian people and people who ordinarily would not set foot inside a church, simply because they were going shoulder to shoulder to address this shared concern for the environment. So yes, the church should be leading, absolutely. And I think there's a wonderful missional edge to that leadership, yeah.
Before we end tonight's session, I'd just like to invite Leslie and Jonathan, because Jonathan made a good point. He said, if everything, if when the new heaven and new earth comes, the world will be healed anyway, right? So why should Christians, be so concerned about this right now if that's what God is going to do in the future?
In short, I would say because we don't know when that end is going to come. So, Jesus could return in 10 years and he could return in 1,000 years. And between now and then, human beings are going to have to live on this planet and are going to have to depend on the fragile, interdependent network of ecosystems that sustain all of life on Earth. And so the reason why, a big part of the reason why we endeavor to sustainably and lovingly and wisely manage the Earth resources is because there are generations coming after us who will have to deal with the legacy we leave behind. And so, when Jesus commanded us to love our neighbors, those neighbors include not only the people who live around us in the present, but those are the people who are coming after us. And so, we don't endeavor to, manage the earth in a wise and sustainable way so that we can kind of hand it back to the Lord on his arrival. We do it for the sake of those who are coming after us, who are going to have to depend on this environment until such time as the Lord does return and ushers in the new kingdom and heals and restores and redeems and liberates all of creation.
Pastor Benny, if there's nothing, I can close up the session because we're hitting the time limit that we promised.
Jackson has a question that was left unanswered. I think it's the only one on the chat. Don't know if you want to tackle that, Tim. You said that we need infrastructure change to turn the tide in climate change. How do you know when you have actually turned the tide, and how does one determine how much infrastructure change is required in order to turn the tide? It's a big picture question.
It is, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it would depend what you're measuring and where you're measuring. So, somebody kind of asked the question of me recently, what of all these issues, which is the most critical? Like, which should we be addressing as a matter of priority? And the answer to that question is it depends where you are. So in some parts of the world, water scarcity is the number one issue. In other parts of the world, it's the quality of the soil. In other parts of the world, it's the levels of air pollution. So turning the tide and measuring whether or not we've turned the tide really depends on where you are and what the critical issue is in that particular region. So it does require some kind of localization. You have to understand what your context, your particular environmental issues, and then what it's going to take to bring change in that. And only once you understand what the nature of the problem is in each locale, then you can kind of measure. As far as the macro scale is concerned, I think if we were able to see some kind of reduction in the Earth's near surface temperature over a sustained period of time, that would be a very positive sign. Although many people in the scientific community, the climate scientists, would say that's not likely to happen now, that we've gone past the critical thresholds. In fact, just the other day, I was talking to a guy here in Perth who used to work for NASA. And he's a climate scientist, and he was saying he's fully convinced that we've already passed some critical thresholds. And so this is no longer going to be about whether or not significant climate change happens. It's now about how are we going to live with it and how are we going to respond to it. So, going to be interesting days ahead.
Well, we've hit the 9:30 threshold that we've promised. Thanks, everyone, for joining in.
We trust that this insight session has helped you to see these topics the way that God sees them in the light of His grand plan and purposes. You can watch our previous Insights webinar by clicking on our Insights YouTube link in the caption below. Feel free to share in the comments what you've learned or any prayer requests you might have. We would love to connect with you and support you in this journey of knowing God. And if you know someone that could benefit from this video or other Faith Online programs, spread the word and share the video link with them. You can also stay updated with Faith Online by hitting that red subscribe button. And do it now. We pray that the Holy Spirit will help you gain even greater insights as you go from here. God bless you.